Hi everybody, welcome to chapter 16. So chapter 15 was a lot of fun because we got to learn more about how Fantasia works, particularly for humans like Bastian. Bastian can create stories and make wishes, and all of his wishes connect to a place or a thing or a character, or it creates a new story somehow. Like his wish to be brave and strong and enduring brought him to peril in the night forest, it brought him to the desert of colors, it brought him to Grogramon, and Grogramon gave him a magic sword, said, "This sword's been waiting for you since the beginning of time, and only you." And Bastian says, "Well, I just barely wished for this stuff, just right now. So, did I wish for it, or has it always been here?" And Grogramon says, "Both. It's Fantasia. Go with it." So, but now it's time for Bastian to leave the Desert of Colors. He has to follow his wishes to Grogramon explained, you need to follow your wishes to find what you really and truly want. And Bastian has no idea what that is. So he's made his way out of the Desert of Colors through the Temple of 1,000 Doors. Every door in Fantasia is magically connected to this place. Doors lead to different places, and it's another one of those places in Fantasia that you can only find on accident, or like just at just the right moment. And one of those moments came on a night when Bastian couldn't even say goodbye to Grogramon because he was still asleep. He was still a statue, and that was very sad. But he's moving on, and we'll see where his wishes take him in Chapter 16, The Silver City of Amarganth. Purple light passed in slow waves across the floor and the walls of the room. It was a hexagonal room, rather like the enlarged cell of a honeycomb. Every second wall had a door in it, and on the intervening walls were painted strange pictures representing landscapes and creatures who seemed to be half plant and half animal. Bastian had entered through one of the doors. The other two, to the right and left of it, were exactly the same shape, but the left-hand door was black, while the right-hand one was white. Bastian chose the white door. In the next room, the light was yellowish. Here again, the walls formed a hexagon. The pictures represented all manner of contrivances that meant nothing to Bastian. Were they tools or weapons? The two doors leading onward to the right and left were the same color, yellow, but the left-hand one was tall and narrow, while the one on the right was low and wide. Bastian chose the left-hand one. The next room was hexagonal like the others, but the light was bluish. The pictures on the wall were of intricate ornaments or characters in a strange alphabet. Here, the two doors were the same color, but of different material, one of wood, the other of metal. Bastian chose the wooden door. It is not possible to describe all the doors and rooms through which Bastian passed during his stay in the Temple of 1,000 Doors. There were doors that looked like large keyholes, and others that resembled the entrances to caves. There were golden doors and rusty iron doors. Some were padded and some were studded with nails. Some were paper thin and others as thick as the doors of treasure houses. There was one that looked like a giant's mouth, and another that had to be opened like a drawbridge. One that suggested a big ear, and one that was made of gingerbread. One that was shaped like an oven door, and one that had to be unbuttoned. The two doors leading out of a room always had something in common: the shape, the material, the size, the color, but there was always some essential difference between them. Bastian had passed many times from one hexagonal room to another. Every decision he made led to another decision that led to yet another decision. But after all these decisions, he was still in the Temple of 1,000 Doors. As he went on and on, he began to wonder why this should be. His wish had sufficed to lead him into the maze, but apparently it was not definite enough to enable him to find the way out. He had wished for company, but now he realized that by company, he had meant no one in particular. This vague wish hadn't helped him at all. Thus far, his decisions had been based more on mere whim and involved very little thought. In every case, he might just as well have taken the other door. At this rate, he would never find his way out. Just then, he was in a room with a greenish light. 3 of the 6 walls had variously shaped clouds painted on them. The door to the left was of white mother of pearl, the one on the right of ebony, and suddenly he knew whom he wished for. Atreyu! The mother of pearl door reminded Bastian of Falcor, the luck dragon, whose scales glistened like mother of pearl, so he decided on that one. In the next room, one of the two doors was made of plated grass, the other was an iron grating. Just then, Bastian was thinking of the grassy ocean where Atreyu was at home, so he picked the grass door. In the next room, he found two doors, which differed only in that one was made of leather and the other of felt. Bastian chose the leather one. Then he was faced with two more doors, and again he had time to think. One was purple, the other olive green. Atreyu was a greenskin, and his cloak was made from the hide of a purple buffalo. A symbol such as Atreyu had on his forehead and cheeks when Chiron came to him was painted in white on the olive green door. But the purple door had the same symbol on it, and Bastian didn't know that Atreyu's cloak had been ornamented with just such symbols. That door, he thought, must lead to someone else, not to Atreyu. He opened the olive green door, and then he was outside. To his surprise, he found himself not in the grassy ocean, but in a bright springtime forest. Sunbeams shone through the young foliage and played their games of light and shade on the mossy ground. The place smelled of earth and mushrooms, and the balmy air was filled with the twittering of birds. Bastian turned around and saw that he had just stepped out of a little forest chapel. For that moment, its door had been the way out of the Temple of 1,000 Doors. Bastian opened it again, but all he saw was the inside of a small chapel. The roof consisted only of a few rotten beams, and the walls were covered with moss. Bastian started walking. He had no idea where he was going, but he felt certain that sooner or later he would find Atreyu. The thought made him so happy that he whistled to the birds, who answered him and sang every merry tune that entered his head. A while later, he caught sight of a group of figures in a clearing. As he came closer, they proved to be 4 men in magnificent armor and a beautiful lady who was sitting on the grass strumming a lute. 5 richly caparisoned horses and a pack mule were standing in the background. A white cloth laid with all manner of viands and drink was spread out on the grass before the company. Before joining the group, Bastian hid the childlike empress's amulet under his shirt. He thought it best to see what these people were up to before allowing himself to be recognized. The men stood up and bowed at his approach, evidently taking him for an oriental prince or something of the kind. The fair lady nodded, smiled at him, and went on strumming her lute. One of the men was taller than the rest and more magnificently clad. He had fair hair that hung down over his shoulders. "I am Hero Heinrich," he announced, "and this lady is Princess Oglamar, daughter of the King of Luna. These men are my friends, Hicreon, Hisbald, and Hydorn. And what may your name be, young friend?" "I may not say my name." "Not yet," Bastian replied. "A vow?" Princess Oglamar asked on a note of mockery. "So young, and you've already made a vow?" "Have you come a long way?" Hero Heinrich inquired. "A very long way," Bastian replied. "Are you a prince?" asked the princess with a gracious smile. "That I may not reveal," said Bastian. "Well, welcome in any case to our gathering," cried Hero Heinrich. "Will you honor us by partaking of our repast?" Bastian accepted with thanks, sat down, and began to eat. From the conversation between the lady and the 4 knights, Bastian learned that a tournament was to be held in the large and magnificent silver city of Amarganth, which was not far distant. From far and near, the boldest heroes, the most skillful hunters, the bravest warriors, and all manner of adventurers as well, had come to take part. Only the 3 bravest and best who defeated all the others were to have the honor of joining in a long and perilous expedition, the aim of which was to find a certain person, the so-called savior, who was known to be somewhere in one of the numerous regions of Fantasia. Thus far, no one knew his name. It appeared that at some time in the past, Fantasia had been struck by disaster, but that this savior had appeared on the scene and saved it in the nick of time by giving the childlike empress the name of Moonchild, by which she was now known to everyone in Fantasia. Since then, He had been wandering about the country unknown, and the purpose of the expedition was to find him and keep him safe by serving him as a kind of bodyguard. Only the bravest and ablest men would be chosen for the mission, since it seemed more than likely that formidable adventures awaited them. The tournament at which the three were to be chosen had been organized by Quercabad, the Silver Sage. The city of Amarganth was always ruled by its oldest man or woman, and Quercabad was 107 years old. The winners, however, would not be selected by him, but by one Atreyu, a young greenskin, who was then visiting Sage Quercabad. This Atreyu was to lead the expedition, for he alone was capable of recognizing the savior, since he had seen him once in his magic mirror. Bastian listened in silence. It wasn't easy for him, for he soon realized that this savior was his very own self. And when Atreyu's name came up, his heart laughed within him, and he found it very hard not to give himself away. But he was determined to keep his identity a secret for the present. Hero Heinrich, as it turned out, was not so much concerned with the expedition as with the heart of Princess Oglamar. Bastian had seen at a glance that he was head over heels in love with the young lady. For no apparent reason, he kept sighing and casting mournful glances at her, and she would pretend not to notice. As Bastian learned later on, she had vowed to marry no one but the greatest of all heroes, who proved himself able to defeat all others. She wouldn't be satisfied with less. But how could Hero Heinrich prove that he was the greatest? After all, he couldn't just go out and kill someone who had done him no harm, and as for wars, there hadn't been any for ages. He would gladly have fought monsters or demons. He would gladly have brought her a fresh dragon's tail for breakfast every morning. But far and wide, there were no monsters, demons or dragons to be found. So naturally, when the messengers from Quercabad, the Silver Sage, had invited him to the tournament, he had accepted forthwith. But Princess Oglamar had insisted on coming along, for she wanted to see his performance with her own eyes. "Everybody knows," she said with a smile, "that heroes are not to be believed. They all tend to exaggerate their achievements." "Exaggeration or not," said Hero Heinrich, "I can assure you that I'm a better man than this legendary savior." "How can you know that?" Bastian asked. "Well," said Hero Heinrich, "if the fellow was half as strong and brave as I am, he wouldn't need a bodyguard to take care of him. He sounds kind of pathetic to me." "How can you say such a thing?" cried Oglamar with indignation. "Didn't he save Fantasia from destruction?" "What of it?" said Hero Heinrich with a sneer. "That didn't take much of a hero." Bastian decided to teach him a little lesson at the first opportunity. The three other knights had merely fallen in with the couple en route. Hickrien, who had a bristling black moustache, claimed to be the most powerful swordsman in all Fantasia. Hisbald, who had red hair and seemed frail in comparison with the others, claimed that no one was quicker and more nimble with a sword than he. And Hydorn was convinced that he had no equal for endurance in combat. His exterior seemed to support his contention, for he was tall and lean, all bone and sinew. After the meal, they prepared to resume their journey. The crockery and provisions were packed into the saddlebags. Princess Oglamar mounted her white palfrey and trotted off without so much as a backward look at the others. Hero Heinrich leapt on his coal-black stallion and galloped after her. The three other knights offered Bastian a ride on their pack mule, which he accepted. Whereupon they started through the forest on their splendidly caparisoned steeds, while Bastian brought up the rear. Bastian's mount, an aged she-mule, dropped farther and farther behind. Bastian tried to goad her on, but instead of quickening her pace, the mule stopped still, twisted her neck to look back at him, and said, "Don't urge me on, sire. I've lagged behind on purpose." "Why?" Bastian asked. "Because I know who you are." "How can that be?" "When a person is only half an ass like me, and not a complete one, she senses certain things. Even the horses had an inkling. You needn't say anything, sire. I'd have been so glad to tell my children and grandchildren that I carried the Savior on my back and was first to welcome him. Unfortunately, mules don't get children. What's your name? Bastian asked. Yika, sire. Look here, Yika. Don't spoil my fun. Could you keep what you know to yourself for the time being? Gladly, sire. And the mule trotted off to catch up with the others. The group were waiting on a knoll at the edge of the forest, looking down with wonderment at the city of Amarganth, which lay gleaming in the sunlight before them. From the height where they stood, the travelers had a broad view over a large violet-blue lake surrounded on all sides by similar wooded hills. In the middle of this lake lay the silver city of Amarganth. The houses were all supported by boats, and the larger palaces by great barges. Every house and every ship was made of finely chiseled, delicately ornamented silver. The windows and doors of the palaces, great and small, the towers and balconies were all of finely wrought silver filigree, unequaled in all Fantasia. The lake was studded with boats of all sizes, carrying visitors to the city from the mainland. Hero Heinrich and his companions hastened down the shore, where a silver ferry with a magnificently curved prow was waiting. There was room in it for the whole company, horses, pack mule, and all. On the way, Bastian learned from the ferryman, whose clothes were of woven silver, that the violet-blue water of the lake was so salty and bitter that only silver, and a special kind of silver at that, could withstand its corrosive action for any length of time. The name of this lake was Moru, or Lake of Tears. In times long past, the people of Amarganth had ferried their city to the middle of the lake to protect it from invasion, since ships of wood or iron were quick to disintegrate in the acrid water. And at present, there was yet another reason for leaving Amarganth in the middle of the lake, for the inhabitants had gotten to the habit of regrouping their houses and moving their streets and squares about when the fancy struck them. Suppose, for instance, that two families living at opposite ends of towns made friends or intermarried. Why, then they would simply move their silver ships close together and become neighbors. Bastian would gladly have heard more, but the ferry had reached the city, and he had to get out with his traveling companions. Their first concern was to find lodgings for themselves and their mounts. No easy matter, since Amarganth was literally overrun by visitors who had come from far and near for the tournament. At length, they found lodgings in an inn. After taking the she-mule to the stable, Bastian whispered in her ear, "Don't forget your promise, Yika. I'll be seeing you soon again." Yika nodded. Then Bastian told his traveling companions that he didn't wish to be a burden to them any longer and would look about the town on his own. After thanking them for their kindness, he took his leave. Actually, he was intent on finding Atreyu. The large and small boats were connected by gangplanks, some so narrow that only one person could cross them at a time, others as wide as good-sized streets. There were also arched bridges with roofs over them, and in the canals between the palace ships, hundreds of small boats were moving back and forth. But wherever you went or stood, you felt a gentle rise and fall underfoot, just enough to remind you that the whole city was afloat. The visitors, who had literally flooded the city, were so varied and colorful that it would take a whole book to describe them. The Amarganthians were easy to recognize, for they all wore clothes of a silver fabric that was almost as fine as Bastian's mantle. Their hair, too, was silver. They were tall and well-built, and their eyes were as violet blue as Moru, the Lake of Tears. Most of the visitors were not quite so attractive. There were muscle-bound giants with heads that seemed no larger than apples between their huge shoulders. There were sinister-looking night rowdies, bold, solitary individuals whom, as one could see at a glance, it was not best to tangle with. There were flimflams with shifty eyes and nimble fingers, and berserkers with smoke coming out of their mouths and noses. There were topsy-turvies who spun like living tops, and wood goblins who trotted about on gnarled, crooked legs, carrying stout clubs over their shoulders. Once Bastian even saw a rock chewer, with teeth like steel chisels jutting out of his mouth. The silver gangplank bent under his weight as he came stomping along. But before Bastian could ask him if by any chance he was Pjornkrechark, he had vanished into the crowd. At length, Bastian reached the center of the city, where the tournament was already in full swing. In a circular open space that looked like a giant arena, hundreds of contestants were measuring their strength, showing their mettle. Around the edges, a crowd of onlookers egged the participants on, and the windows and balconies of the surrounding palace ships were packed with enthusiasts. Some had even managed to climb up on the filigree-ornamented roofs. At first, Bastian paid little attention to the tournament. He was looking for Atreyu, feeling sure that he must be somewhere in the crowd. Then he noticed that the onlookers kept turning expectantly toward one of the palaces, especially when a contestant had performed some particularly impressive feat. But before he could get a good look at the palace, Bastian had to thrust his way across one of the bridges and climb a sort of lamppost. 2 silver chairs had been set up on a wide balcony. In one sat an aged man whose silver beard and hair hung down to his waist. That must be Quercabad, the Silver Sage. Beside him sat a boy of about Bastian's age. He was wearing long trousers made of soft leather, and he was bare from the waist up, and Bastian saw that his skin was olive green. The expression of his lean face was grave, almost stern. His long blue-black hair was gathered together and held back by leather thongs. Over his shoulder, he wore a purple cloak. He was looking calmly and yet somehow eagerly down at the arena. Nothing seemed to escape his dark eyes. Who could it be but Atreyu? At that moment, an enormous face appeared in the open balcony door behind Atreyu. It looked rather like a lion's, except that it had white mother-of-pearl scales instead of fur, and long white fangs jutted out of the mouth. The eyeballs sparkled ruby red, and when the head rose above Atreyu, Bastian saw that it rested on a long, supple neck from which hung a mane that looked like white fire. Of course, it was Falkor, the luck dragon, and he seemed to be whispering something in Atreyu's ear, for Atreyu nodded. Bastian slid down the lamppost. He had seen enough. Now he could watch the tournament. Tournament was hardly the right word. The contests that were in progress added up to something more like a big circus. There was a wrestling match between 2 giants who twined their bodies into one huge knot that kept rolling this way and that. Individuals of like or divergent species vied with one another in swordsmanship or in skill at handling the club or lance, but none had any serious intention of killing his adversary. The rules called for fair fighting and the strictest self-control. Any contestant so misled by anger or ambition as to injure an opponent seriously would have been automatically disqualified. Many defeated combatants had left the arena when Bastian saw Hicreon the Strong, Hisbald the Swift, and Hydorn the Enduring make their appearance. Hero Heinrich and Princess Oglamar were not with them. By then, there were scarcely more than 100 contestants left. Since these were a selection from among the best and strongest, Hicreon, Hisbald, and Hydorn had a much harder time of it than they may have expected. It took all afternoon for Hicreon to prove himself the strongest among the strong, Hisbald the swiftest among the swift, and Hydorn the most enduring among the enduring. The onlookers applauded with a will, and all 3 bowed in the direction of the balcony, where Silver Sage Quercabad and Atreyu were sitting. Atreyu was getting up to say something when yet another contestant appeared. Heinrich. An expectant silence fell, and Atreyu sat down. Since only 3 men were to accompany him on his expedition, there was one too many in the field. One would have to withdraw. "Sires," said Hero Heinrich in a loud voice, "I would not suggest that your strength can have been impaired by the little display you have just made of your abilities. Under the circumstances, however, it would be unworthy of me to challenge you singly. Since I have thus far seen no adversary up to my standards, I have not participated in the contests. Consequently, I am still fresh. If any of you should feel too exhausted, he is free to stand aside. Otherwise, I am prepared to face all 3 of you at once. Any objections?" "No," replied all 3 in unison. A furious battle followed. Hickrion's blows had lost none of their force, but Hero Heinrich was stronger. His ball assailed him from all sides like streaks of lightning, but Heinrich was quicker. Heidorn tried to wear him down, but Hero Heinrich had greater endurance. After barely 10 minutes, all three were disarmed, and all three bent their knees to Hero Heinrich. He looked proudly about him, evidently hoping for an admiring glance from his lady, who must have been somewhere in the crowd. The cheers of the onlookers swept over the arena like a hurricane, and could no doubt be heard on the farthermost shore of Lake Moru. When the applause died down, Goab, the Silver Sage, stood up and asked, in a loud voice, "Does anyone wish to oppose Hero Heinrich?" A hush fell on the crowd. Then a boy's voice was heard. "Yes, I do." All eyes turned toward Bastian. The crowd opened a path for him, and he strode into the arena. Cries of amazement and pity were heard. "How handsome he is! What a shame! This must be stopped." "Who are you?" asked Silver Sage Goab. "I will reveal my name afterward," said Bastian. He saw that Atreyu had narrowed his eyes and was studying him closely, but had not yet made up his mind. "Young friend," said Hero Heinrich, "we have eaten and drunk together. Why would you want me to put you to shame? I pray you withdraw your challenge and go away." "No," said Bastian, "I meant what I said." Hero Heinrich hesitated a moment. Then he said, "It would be wrong of me to measure myself in combat with you. Let us first see who can shoot an arrow higher." "Very well," said Bastian. A stout bow and an arrow were brought for each of them. Heinrich drew the bowstring and shot the arrow so high that the eye could not follow. At almost the same moment, Bastian pulled his bowstring and shot his arrow after it. It was some time before the arrows came down and fell to the ground between the two archers. Then it became evident that Bastian's red-feathered arrow had struck Hero Heinrich's blue-feathered arrow at its apogee with such force as to split it open and wedge itself into it. Hero Heinrich stared at the telescoped arrows. He had turned rather pale, but his cheeks had broken out in red spots. "That can only be an accident," he muttered. "Let's see who does better with the foils." He asked for 2 foils and 2 decks of cards. Both were brought. He shuffled both decks of cards carefully. Then he threw one deck high into the air, drew his blade with the speed of lightning, and thrust. When all the other cards had fallen to the ground, it could be seen that he had struck the ace of hearts in the center of its one heart. And holding up his foil with the card spitted on it, he again looked about for his lady. Then Bastian tossed the other deck in the air, and his blade flashed. Not a single card fell to the ground. He had pierced all 52 cards of the deck exactly in the middle, and moreover, in the right order, though Hero Heinrich had shuffled them ever so carefully. Hero Heinrich looked at the cards. He said nothing, but his lips trembled. But you won't outdo me in strength," he stammered finally. A number of weights were still lying about from the previous contests. He seized the heaviest, and slowly, straining every muscle, he lifted it. But before he could set it down, Bastian had grabbed hold of him and lifted him along with the weight. Hero Heinrich's face took on a look of such misery that some of the onlookers could not repress a smile. "Thus far," said Bastian, "you have chosen the nature of our contests. Will you allow me to suggest something?" Hero Heinrich nodded in silence. "Nothing can daunt my courage." "In that case," said Bastian, "I propose a swimming race across the Lake of Tears." A breathless silence fell on the assemblage. Hero Heinrich turned red and pale by turns. "That's no test of courage," he expostulated. "It's madness." "I'm ready," said Bastian. At that, Hero Heinrich lost his self-control. "No!" he shouted, stamping his foot. "You know as well as I do that the water of Moru dissolves everything. It would be certain death." "I'm not afraid," said Bastian calmly. "I've crossed the desert of colors. I've eaten and drunk the fire of the many-colored death and bathed in it. I'm not afraid of any water." You're lying, roared Hero Heinrich, purple with rage. No one in all Fantasia can survive the many-colored death. Any child knows that. Hero Heinrich, said Bastian slowly, instead of calling me a liar, why not admit that you're just plain scared? That was too much for Hero Heinrich. Beside himself with rage, he drew his big sword from its sheath and flung himself on Bastian. Bastian stepped back. He was about to say a word of warning, but Hero Heinrich didn't leave him time. He struck out in earnest, and in that same moment, the sword Secunda leapt from its rusty sheath into Bastian's hand and began to dance. What happened next was so amazing that not one of the onlookers would forget it as long as he lived. Luckily, Bastian couldn't let go of the hilt and was obliged to follow Secunda's lightning-like movements. First, it sliced Hero Heinrich's lovely armor into little pieces. They flew in all directions, but his skin was not even scratched. Hero Heinrich swung his sword like a madman in a desperate effort to defend himself, but he was blinded by Secunda's whirling light, and none of his blows struck home. At length, he was stripped to his underclothes, but still he went on fighting. And then Secunda cut his weapon into little bits so quickly that what had been a whole sword only a moment before fell tinkling to the ground like a pile of coins. Hero Heinrich stared aghast at the useless hilt, dropped it, and hung his head. Secunda left Bastian's hand and flew back into its rusty sheath. A cry of admiration rose from 1,000 throats. The onlookers stormed the arena, seized Bastian, lifted him onto their shoulders, and carried him around in triumph. From his lofty perch, Bastian looked for Hero Heinrich. He felt sorry for the poor fellow and wanted to give him a kind word. He hadn't intended to make such a fool out of him. But Hero Heinrich was nowhere to be seen. The silence fell. The crowd moved aside. There stood Atreyu, smiling up at Bastian. Bastian smiled back. His bearers let him down from their shoulders. For a long while, the two boys looked at each other in silence. Then Atreyu spoke. If I still needed someone to accompany me on the search for the savior of Fantasia, I would content myself with just this one, for he is worth more than 100 others. But I need no companion, because there will be no expedition. A murmur of surprise and disappointment was heard. The savior of Fantasia has no need of our protection, Atreyu went on, raising his voice, for he can defend himself better than all of us together could defend him, and we have no need to look for him, because he has already found us. I didn't recognize him at first, for when I saw him in the magic mirror gate of the Southern Oracle, he was different from now. Entirely different. But I didn't forget the look in his eyes. It's the same look that I see now. I couldn't be mistaken. Bastian shook his head and said with a smile, You're not mistaken, Atreyu. It was you who brought me to the childlike Empress to give her a new name, and for that I thank you. An odd whisper passed over the crowd like a gust of wind. You promised, Atreyu replied, to tell me your name, which is known to no one in Fantasia except the golden-eyed Commander of Wishes. Will you tell us now? My name is Bastian Balthazar Bucks. At that, the onlookers could contain themselves no longer. Their rejoicing exploded in 1,000 cheers. Many of them started dancing. Bridges and gangplanks, the whole square for that matter, began to sway. Laughing, Atreyu held out his hand to Bastian. Bastian took it, and so, hand in hand, they went to the palace. Silver Sage Quercabad and Falcor the Luck Dragon were waiting on the palace steps. That night, the city of Amarganth staged the finest celebration in all its history. All who had legs, long or short, straight or crooked, danced, and all who had voices, sweet or sour, high or low, sang and laughed. When night fell, the Amarganthians lit thousands of colored lamps on their silver ships and palaces, and at midnight there were fireworks, such as never been seen in Fantasia. Bastian stood on the balcony with Atreyu. To the left and right of them stood Falcor and Silver Sage Quercabad, watching as sheaves of many-colored light and the Silver City's thousands of lamps were reflected in the dark waters of Moru, the Lake of Tears. Okay, sorry that chapter went a little bit long, and if you feel bad for Hero Heinrich, don't feel too bad for him. We haven't seen the last of him. We'll find out what happened to him in the next chapter. See you guys next time.